Hello and welcome. I'm Anand Naidu filling in for Riz Khan. On today's show, we look at the sinister world of organized crime. Criminal gangs have been around for centuries, but since the fall of the Soviet Empire, there's been an alarming proliferation of sophisticated criminal enterprises on almost every continent. Their activities can sometimes even shake legitimate governments. Bulgaria's interior minister resigned earlier this week because of shortcomings in the fight against organized crime. The East European country has been beset by serious crimes since the fall of communism, but matters recently came to a head after gunmen recently killed two prominent Bulgarians amid accusations that police were colluding with the criminal underworld. We take an in-depth look at the issues. Don't forget, we take your calls on the show. You can reach us at the numbers there at the bottom of your screen. From New York, I'm joined by journalist Misha Glenny, who's traced the world of organized crime from Dubai to Brazil to Japan. He's author of the newly published book McMafia, in which he suggests that peace has actually brought crime to many nations and that the fall of communism and the advent of globalization has been eagerly embraced by international crime bosses. And here in Washington, I'm joined by Dennis Lormel, a former FBI special agent. He was chief of the FBI's financial crimes program and currently works for Corporate Risk International. Gentlemen, thanks to both of you for being here. Misha Glenny, let me start with you. When one hears about organized crime, one invariably thinks about the mafia here in the United States or in Italy. But, you know, looking at your book, it's clear now that organized crime has taken a grip throughout the world. And I was just wondering if you could give us some ideas of some of the most powerful organizations that are operating right now.
Absolutely. Well, after the fall of communism in 1989, you had a collapse not just of communism, but of the states in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union as well. And the only way that capitalism could emerge was with these groups of muscle men who were supporting the new businessmen to ensure that their contracts were enforced when they were entered into. And so essentially, within the first 5 years after the fall of communism, most of Eastern Europe was under the control or the semi-control of large organized criminal syndicates. And very soon they realized that as the world was shrinking due to globalization, trade flows were increasing, capital flows and so on, that they could link up with other groups from Africa, for example, from Southern Africa, Western Africa, from South America, and particularly from Colombia and Brazil and Mexico, but also from Asia as well. Everything was up for grabs and markets were emerging everywhere that criminal syndicates could exploit.
So if we look at the history of organized crime, the recent history, let's say over the past 2 or 3 decades, the turning point was really the fall of communism.
The fall of communism combining with the advent of globalization and the increased market opportunities that offered. And certainly the money that was generated from criminal syndicates working in cooperation with the oligarchs in Russia, who got huge sums of money from exploiting the mineral resources in Russia, a move that I describe as the greatest larceny in history. They moved a lot of that money outside of Russia and into different parts of the world, and a lot of it was used as startup capital for other dubious enterprises in many different parts of the world.
Dennis, when we look at this alarming explosion of organized crime around the world, how much of a threat do these criminal enterprises pose to conventional businesses?
Well, they're definitely a threat. They're opportunists, and they're a lot like terrorists, and they're going to take whatever opportunity they can to infiltrate and ultimately manipulate businesses or use them as a conduit to launder money. I think that's the more important threat to businesses, and particularly to financial institutions, is the fact that these criminals now need a place to launder all their proceeds. They make, as Misha points out, an incredible amount of money, and they have to have a means to launder it and to legitimize it. So I think the financial institutions, more than anything, are at risk for these types of organizations.
But generally, I mean, criminals, these type of criminals, are motivated almost exclusively by money. But are you finding that the line between that and, say, political motives is getting blurred?
To a degree. I think they certainly, to the end of the politics, I think that motivation is more to help foster their criminal activities, and certainly their ability to raise money and to maybe legitimize themselves in certain ways to continue that cycle and to move forward.
Misha, let me ask you this. Have you found, while you were researching your book, that drugs are the biggest commodity, if I could put it that way, that sustains organized crime?
I would say narcotics, drugs are one of the really central, almost the backbone of organized criminal activity, because the profits from trafficking in narcotics are so astronomical, so they're extremely attractive. And also what happened after 1989-1990 is that you saw that there was a huge increase in the financial resources and the manpower resources available to global organized crime, but you did not see a concomitant rise in the resources available to law enforcement. And in my experience going around the world talking to both gangsters and law enforcement officers and agencies around the world, you've seen law enforcement having tremendous problems trying to get attention from politicians to the issue specifically of organized crime. It hasn't been so much of a problem since 2001 in terms of getting resources to counter terrorism, but terrorism often exists within the much larger swamp of what I like to call the shadow economy. And this is really an issue that has been neglected, and law enforcement officers often say that they've just been chasing their tail on this one.
Have you found that as well, Dennis, that the growth of organized crime has not been matched by similar kind of law enforcement efforts to catch up?
Yes, I think that's a really good point. I think that law enforcement's capacity is really limited because they don't have the resources in terms of the financial support that they need and actually the manpower that they need. I think there are some really good law enforcement initiatives, and if you look, for instance, at the FBI and their traditional organized crime program in fighting the traditional, like, for instance, the Italian organized crime and such, they've done a very good job. But the growth of Eurasian organized crime, the Russian organized crime, the Asian organized crime, African organized crime has really outpaced law enforcement's ability to stay up with those types of issues. And I think the troubling problem, one of the troubling problems, is that as law enforcement succeeds and they eliminate some of these groups or disrupt some of these groups in their operations, there's another group right behind them to step in and maintain or take over their operation, whereas law enforcement doesn't have that sustainability.
Misha, the other thing is, have you found that there's been a vacuum in law enforcement in changing societies? You know, the two countries that come immediately to mind would be South Africa and the Soviet Union, because police forces in those countries were not used to combat crime before they changed. They were used more as a political tool. So once those societies had changed, there was this huge vacuum.
That's absolutely right. It's very difficult for police to get a grip with things in transitional societies. And if we look at the very specific case of South Africa, before 1994 and the introduction of multi-party democracy, basically the police force was looking after 15% of the population, which was the white population, and the black and colored populations, as they're known in South Africa, were penned into their areas, and basically they had to look after themselves. Now, after 1994, the same budget, or indeed a smaller budget, had to be responsible for offering a police service to the entire country. This put a tremendous strain on the incoming administration. They managed it admirably well, but they had to cut their policing of certain parts of society. And what you saw was that things like border control, control of airports in South Africa were dramatically reduced after 1994. And it became a target for groups from all over the world who were attracted by South Africa's very effective first world economic infrastructure, but also attracted by the developing world capacity of the South African state. And it became a pivot of organized crime moving stuff from east to west, from south to north, from all over the world, notwithstanding the best efforts of police and politicians in South Africa.
And do you see that vacuum continuing for the foreseeable future, or will it get better once these democracies consolidate and take a better grip?
Well, you're seeing in Russia what I believe to be the end of full-tilt gangster capitalism and the might of the Russian state, which is, of course has a huge tradition, reasserting itself and bringing organized crime frequently under the control of the state, if not actually extinguishing it. So there you are seeing a big change. And also in countries like Bulgaria, which you mentioned at the beginning after the resignation of Rumen Petkov, the Interior Ministry, here its membership of the European Union is forcing Bulgaria to confront the issue of organized crime. So there are some bright spots around the globe. But remember, in many parts of the world, organized crime has succeeded in capturing, or semi-capturing, as we say, the state. And so they are controlling the levers of society right at the very heart of government. And it's often extremely difficult to displace them.
Okay, gentlemen, we are going to take a break right now. We're talking with author and journalist Misha Glenny and former FBI Special Agent Dennis Lawmel about international organized crime. Our conversation continues in a few minutes, but first that break. I'll be right back.